Russia's carried out airstrikes in western Ukraine early on Sunday. The capital, Kyiv, and the western city of Lviv were both targeted. Polish authorities say one Russian missile violated their airspace before returning to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces say they've hit two Russian ships, a communications center and other infrastructure in Crimea. We're going to take a closer look at who controls what in Ukraine after 2 years of war. Now, Russia's been making small advances in the east. It says it seized a village in the western outskirts of Bakhmut. Last month, Russian troops also captured Avdiivka near Donetsk, the first major territorial gain in 10 months. And this comes ahead of reports that Moscow's preparing for a new offensive, possibly by the end of next month. Well, Patrick Burry is a defence and security analyst at the University of Bath. He's also a former NATO analyst, and he's joining us live from London. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. When we've been reporting on what's been happening between Russia and Ukraine, certainly over the last month or so, the targeting appears to be more centred towards infrastructure and military targets rather than apartment buildings, resulting in the many deaths that we saw at the start of the conflict. What's your assessment of where we are in the war at the moment?
Good afternoon, Rob. I think essentially the momentum, as Zelensky himself said, Russia has won the winter, and I think the momentum has shifted to the Russian forces on the ground, at least. Avdiivka was a proof of that. They took it at high costs, but they took it nonetheless. And the big question now is there something brewing in probably May once the mud starts to dry in that area of Ukraine? So we'll have to wait and see. I'm sure that the Ukrainians' priorities are basically manpower, where they're short, their soldiers are exhausted because they don't have enough troops to rotate them out. So they really need to get the mobilization of the next batch of conscripts essentially sorted out. And that takes time, and it takes time to train them up. They've also got the issue of fortifications, which they need to prepare and better prepare than they have already. They've been starting that since December, and it's ongoing. And of course, you've got the ammunition question and the weapons question, which is a lot heavily reliant on the US, though not entirely, given France, UK, Germany, and the EU is pumping money in now. So essentially, it's not all bad news for Ukraine. They've obviously hit, as we saw in the last few hours, they've hit the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol again, reduced some of their carriers that they have by about 30% over the last year. So they are making gains there. We've seen the attacks on the refineries as well, which will have a harassing impact, but it doesn't look good either for Russia. So, and Russia, although they're getting into their groove, they haven't totally found it yet. I mean, they still have major problems. They are learning, though, and getting better.
As you were saying, there's a lot of speculation now that there might be something of a spring offensive by Russia, not least because, of course, Vladimir Putin had such a success in the presidential elections recently. There was a lot of suggestion that that would give him an extra impetus to push forward. For those of us watching from the outside, what should we be looking for that might give us an indication that Russia is gearing up for some sort of major action in the coming months?
Well, of course, the Russians will be doing their absolute best to disguise and camouflage any kind of troop buildup, but unlike the initial invasion. So that's what they'll be, and it's very, very difficult to do now, given the ubiquitous surveillance of satellites and other platforms. So it's very difficult to do, and that means that actually the defensive form of warfare, as we've seen with the Ukrainians defending Kyiv, first of all with a mobile defense, then a static defense, pushing the Russians back, then the Ukrainians struggling against the Russian prepared defensives. So it's very difficult to mass in secret and then break through in the current moment. So the defense is on the ascendancy, and we'll just have to see whether the Russians have the ability to do that. But I've certainly seen footage in the last 6 weeks of armored attacks on the front line, where basically the company, 20 vehicles are wiped out in about 3 minutes. It goes to show you the lethality of this ubiquitous surveillance on the battlefield. And if the Russians can do something, they'll probably revert to type, which is about battering their way through with huge amounts of artillery and trying to exploit that window, which is, growing because the supplies haven't come in, especially from the US, which they've been needed to be in back in November. So there's going to be a window now where the Ukrainians are really up against it.
One of the things that we've seen repeatedly is the Ukrainian forces taking out targets in the Black Sea Fleet. Given what you were saying about a possible Russian move forward in the event that it gets to spring, why should the Ukrainians be focusing, do you think, so much on the Black Sea Fleet? Is there a suggestion that there might be some threat from that angle?
Well, the Black Sea Fleet has been one area of really good success for the Ukrainians, and it's obviously what they've managed to do is destroy some of the air defence on Sevastopol, and then start to use what look like UK-supplied Storm Shadows and French Scout missiles to destroy then, Black Sea shipping, essentially these landing crafts. Up until a few weeks ago, this would have been really important because the Russians were using those landing craft to resupply some of the troops down the south. But their engineers, as far as I understand, have actually managed to get a railway running so that it won't have the same strategic impact. So that's the one thing. And on the other thing, of course, by pushing the Black Sea Fleet back further east and out of the Black Sea, essentially, it is allowing Ukraine to get more and more grain exports out, which is important to the war economy. These big wars are won by civilians, essentially, and this is a big war, and it's going to be a long war, and they're won by civilians and industrial capacity. And that includes both, obviously, Ukrainian society, but also the industrial capacity of the West, because Russia's put its war economy on about a 75% war footing.
Patrick Burry, we appreciate you giving us the benefit of your expertise in this. It's really interesting. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Rob.